Speaker.
I call Kevin Haig.
Yeah, I think 2 minutes had expired, so I was expecting the call to come any moment. Mr. Speaker, it's a second reading debate, and ordinarily in a second reading I would be looking for the departmental report summarising the submissions. I'd be looking for the Select Committee's report on what the New Zealand public had to say about the bill we were considering, and looking for the track changes version of the bill, because there always is a track changes version, isn't there, Mr. Speaker? Because invariably, the bill that is introduced to this House is considered for a first reading, goes away to a Select Committee and comes back changed. It comes back changed because actually scrutinising the bill for a little bit longer results in improvements to it. And so that, Mr. Speaker, is why unnecessary urgency is a bad practice for democracy, a bad practice for lawmaking. There is no conceivable reason for urgency for this bill, Mr. Speaker, and the bill itself would have been better for going to a Select Committee. So I'm going to start, instead of quoting from the Select Committee report, I'll just quote from the problem definition in the regulatory impact statement. Now, what that says at point 25, para 25, is in December 2014, Cabinet agreed a direction for reform of the social housing sector which creates a fair, effective and efficient social housing market. Mr. Speaker. Yet the reason that government needs to be involved in providing social housing at all is that experience in the real world has shown that social housing is a service that is not well matched to need by markets at all. A market is the very last thing that we need in social housing, Mr. Speaker. Instead, Mr. Speaker, this bill is not about providing for need, it's about providing for the government's ideological beliefs. In particular, this ideology of the smaller state, and I thank Mr. Ducey for his very witty joke and his contribution in this debate. On the 1st of November last year, the Minister, Paula Bennett, admitted that in fact this was a state asset sale. She said so on national television, continuing that ideological program of state asset sales, winnowing down the size of the state that was commenced by the government in the last couple of terms. She also went on to say, and Bill English later on in this House confirmed, that there was no guarantee whatsoever that any of the proceeds from selling off those state assets would be used to create new houses, to build any new houses. In other words, it was just about shuffling around the ownership arrangements of the houses, not about housing anyone extra at all. Mr. Speaker, simply shifting responsibility for housing of vulnerable New Zealanders onto charities or to the private sector, and then banking the cash from a fire sale of those assets won't solve anything at all. Almost 5,000 families were on the waiting list for a state home in December, and the census showed over 200,000 people in Auckland, including around 63,000 children, were now living in a crowded household because of the shortage of housing, Mr. Speaker. Those children, as Annette King has said, are at growing risk of diseases of overcrowding, diseases of poverty, skin infections, respiratory conditions, rheumatic fever. Rheumatic fever, as Annette King has said, where the program that the government introduced with all the fanfare in the last term of Parliament, it's lowered the axe on in the budget today with no fanfare whatsoever. Mr. Speaker, those kids don't need to be made the responsibility of a charity. They need a real, tangible place to call home. New Zealand's housing crisis is caused fundamentally by a lack of affordable homes, selling off state houses so that developers can make money by sitting on the land or building more expensive homes, which is precisely what is going on under this government, cannot possibly be the answer. Mr. Speaker, this bill also serves the ideological belief of this government that its role is only to be a provider of a small amount of help as a last resort, rather than as the guarantor of those basic rights that New Zealanders hold. Bill English, again, in a meeting that he held with the editorial staff of the New Zealand Herald, said that Housing New Zealand has, and I'm quoting, Mr. Speaker, has become a pool of long-term dependency. You get in and you stay in so you don't move out, so it's creating large future liabilities having them in here. If you go back to the original report, and he refers to a report from the Department of Building and Housing, their big thing was about mobility. So how you meet serious housing needs but enable people to keep moving back up the ladder to independence, which is, Mr. Speaker, a somewhat cynical way of saying that actually the government's agenda here is about minimising the cost of providing services for people. And that ladder towards independence, that's the very ladder that the government proposes whisking out from more and more state house tenants under the reviewable tenancies scheme. Mr. Speaker, this bill is also about the ideology of separating out policy advice from the basic grounding that the policy advice could benefit from by being co-located with the planning and funding and provision functions that exist in Housing New Zealand. I can almost, Mr. Speaker, conjure up that early 90s environment. I can imagine the hairstyles, I can think of the shoulder pads, the chrome, the pink and grey stripes, and probably, Mr. Speaker, I imagine that's the environment in the rarefied atmosphere of MB, the government department that this cabinet, this government can trust to give it the ideologically pure advice on policy around housing that it so desperately craves. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.